Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining Justworks' first installment of our Ask an Expert series. Today, our webinar is subtitled How Can Employers Help Their Teams and Themselves Cope with Layoffs and Unexpected Staffing Changes? I'm Moses Balian, a certified HR consultant at Justworks, where I assist customers with best practices guidance with respect to HR processes and strategy. Joining me today is Dr. Sarah Adler, Chief Clinical Officer at Octave, who is here to share some insights with respect to human psychology and cognitive behavior in light of COVID-19. I'm so excited to dive in. Please note that none of this shall be construed as legal advice or legal services. We're not going to really flirt with that realm anyway. And please be advised that today we are not talking about the legal landscape surrounding COVID-19. So Families First Coronavirus Response Act, CARES Act, PPP loans is not the subject of today's webinar. If you're already a Justworks customer, please by all means call in, speak to your account manager or one of our support agents about that. We'd love to help you. If you're not a Justworks customer, think about it. It's a great experience. And please do save your questions for the end. The first 20 minutes of this webinar today will be a presentation and interview with Sarah. The last 10 minutes will be reserved for Q&A. As you all know, we've been collectively going through a lot given the current situation with COVID-19. People across the country are in varying states of lockdown or stay-at-home orders, and there's a lot that's scary and uncertain. All of these emotions are hard to deal with for employers and managers alike, and it can be a particular challenge to process all of the things that are going on while maintaining a position of leadership. So in this session today, we want to cover some of the topics that stem from the climate of the day and what they mean for your work life. This will be things like mental hygiene, maintaining healthy behaviors in isolation, and helping teams navigate staffing changes, as well as self-care for employers, entrepreneurs, managers, and business leaders alike through these challenging times. So let's start with an interview with Sarah with some prepared questions when it comes to psychology of grief and coping pertaining to COVID-19. So Sarah, my first question for you is, how do people actually process events like overall uncertain times, work reductions, business closures, which is to say, how do people psychologically process grief and cope with it?
So it's such an interesting question because from a scientific perspective, our bodies do something very standard. And from a human perspective, what the standard thing we do with our body shows up really differently. So in short, everyone reacts really differently to uncertain times along a continuum. We're hardwired biologically to really despise uncertainty. And there's actually this really cool study from 2016 that showed that if we know something terrible is going to happen, it's actually less stressful for us than simply not knowing what is going to happen at all, which is fascinating, right? It's actually explained, though, when you understand the science, by our dopamine reward system. And I think you've probably all heard about dopamine. It's that awesome neurotransmitter that regulates our reward system. So it's the guy that is associated with everything that feels really, really good in the moment: food, drugs, alcohol, whatever, exercise. And it's the thing that makes you feel really crappy when you take it away. So what the study showed is that the amount of dopamine that actually floods your system is the same regardless of whether or not you've got good news coming or bad news coming. And the purpose of that is so you can rev up and take action, either by moving towards something or moving away from the stimulus. And the interesting, fascinating thing is the dopamine system has actually learned fairly well over time and over evolution how to assess for probabilities of when something good or bad is going to happen. So when we don't have any idea of what's coming, or the probability is close to 50-50 that something bad or good will happen, our stress response actually shoots up. Our cortisol level goes through the roof, our adrenaline starts pumping, and our bodies get ready for that fight or flight that we always hear about. Understandably, action is needed most when consequences are least predictable. And so it makes a lot of sense that in a time of COVID, when we're all in quarantine and we have no clue what's coming next, when it's going
Got
to
it.
end, what's going to happen, that we would be even more stressed than if for some reason we knew the apocalypse was coming in 3 weeks.
Better to see the train barreling down the tracks toward you from the distance.
From a physiological, biological perspective, it just is. Yeah.
Wow. What are some ways that to support people during this time? Do you have any like tips and tricks for maintaining healthy behaviors?
I do. And it's interesting at Octave. So I'm a clinical psychologist, but in my role at Octave as CCO, I actually have a staff of 50 employees myself. So I think I count as a leader in that
Definitely.
capacity.
Definitely.
So I'm going to share some of what the science tells us are good things to do, and a little bit of how I've implemented those as well. I think the number one best ways, I've distilled this down into kind of 5 points, but the top of the arc here is to really recognize that there's a continuum of how your employers are going to react to stress and to stressful situations. And you should include yourself in that. There's a continuum of how you may react and how your other peers might react as well. So the first thing that I recommend is mindfulness. There are 3,000 years of mindfulness before we had the science to back it up anecdotally, that this is just, I know we hear about it all the time in the news, but be mindful. Learn some of the signs of stress in yourself and in your employees. Really encourage your teams to pay attention to their own stress signals. And if they don't know what they are, encourage them to figure it out and to be aware and to be mindful. Cultivate a culture of mindfulness. And also, I think it's fairly important. One of the things that I've noticed, not with my clinician team, but with my more operational administrative team, is that sometimes my employees try to hide these stress signals or their feelings in a guise of professionalism, which makes a lot of sense if they're trying to cover up. Some of them don't. Some of them are very emotional and very out there with their emotions. But again, it sort of represents that continuum. And it's my job, I think, as a leader, to make sure that there's space for both and that I'm really attuned. The second thing that I've implemented, and this goes along with mindfulness, is to institute a check-in really at the start of every single meeting. This can seem like a waste of time, especially when time is short, but I cannot kind of impart how valuable it's really been. Check-ins can range from a brief stress check on a scale of 0 to 10 to help orient yourself and others to where each person in the meeting is. It can be something lighthearted and fun. I think recently, what did we do? Yesterday for our leadership team meeting, we checked in about what everyone Coke baked for the weekend, because everyone's moving towards baking.
Right.
So it can, depending on who's in the meeting and whether or not what your objectives are, the check-in can be really different. There can be a range. Share your favorite COVID meme. I think the take home though is that leaders who institute check-ins and who are showing that they're being mindful, you're sending a really big signal to your team that you're paying attention, and that can in itself feel incredibly calming.
Okay. Great.
My third point is to make sure that your employees, your teams have the tools that they need to do their jobs. And when I say tools, I can think about very practical, tangible, tactical tools like, is there wireless transmitting at the right BPS? Do they have ergonomic support? Do they understand what their roles and responsibilities are? One of the very fascinating things that we've learned from crisis situations is that stress is highest in the workplace when people do not feel able to do their jobs. And so it's our job as leaders to ask, either formally through, I actually have a checklist of all of the different roles in my organization and what I think the key needs are. And I actually give out checklists to say, do you have what you need? Or more informally, to pay attention. To really show that you're paying attention and that you are asking people if they're prepared.
And what does our fourth ear icon mean?
I'm sorry?
What does our fourth icon mean?
Our fourth icon in terms of validation. Validation is, I think, just a fundamental importance here. And this actually goes along with asking people if they feel prepared, right? Validating both to yourself and to everyone else involved that this is really, really tough. This is a tough time. We're all in it together. And this starts, I think, as leaders, which is something that is so difficult. I can share this as with my work as a psychologist, but also as a team lead. When you are stressed out yourself, active listening becomes really, really hard, and listening to other people's needs looks hard. So that takes me back to point number one, which is do a check-in so everyone knows where you are. Reinforcing that the stress that we're all undergoing is super normal. It's a normal part of what's going on. And even if you are unable to ask, or unable to meet all of the needs that your teams have, listening actively and validating that their needs are relevant and useful can go a long way. And I think this is really important because oftentimes I've heard leaders say, if I open that can of worms, people are going to start asking for everything, and my business just isn't able to support those needs. So what do you need right now? Oh, I need 50% increase in my PTO.
Right.
That's not a sustainable business practice, but validating the underlying emotion that's pulling for that need can go a long way. So it's sort of like
that's a great transition to how can employers take care of themselves in order to exercise validation and mindfulness and be able to use some of their emotional piggy bank on their employees.
Yeah, and I think and that's actually my fifth bullet point, which is to make sure to take care of yourself. So that's a perfect transition. I think, again, like the tips and tricks that you're using for your employees are fairly similar to the ones that you want to use for yourself. So be mindful, know your own signs of stress and burnout. And if you're not sure, ask your loved ones, ask your friends. They will definitely be able to tell you what your signs of stress are.
I know that's certainly the case for me. I just have to ask my family, and whenever I lack self-awareness, and they'll be sure to tell me.
And it's crazy. People know, they know when you're stressed out, and anyone who's close to you will be able to tell you. It's pretty cool.
Even if you don't. What are some ways that we can model good physical and psychological hygiene during this time?
Yeah, so this is tricky. So I think we've all read in the papers and we've all read all over the place, like the same things we always say: eat well, exercise regularly, log off, model balance, don't demand productivity from yourself. But I think this really goes hand in hand with understanding what your own signs and stress of burnout are. And I think it's also oftentimes very unfair to ask people who are in high stress situations to eat perfectly and exercise perfectly. It's a really difficult thing. So I would also just say, be very gentle with yourself, adopt a non-judgmental stance, know that you're doing your best, and hold at the same time that you're doing the best you can.
How can people have a healthy relationship with perfectionism during this time? Or what if I'm not doing very well and I'm really beating myself up about it?
Exactly. Well, I think that what if I'm beating yourself up about it is just noticing it, just starting with noticing that voice in your head, those red flags that pop up. When you start to notice and you start to notice, oh, look, I'm telling myself I'm not being productive again. That's the best place to start, because once you start noticing it, you see how much it comes up over and over and over again. And that's when you can start to sort of either accept it, to use self-talk to say, you know what, we're all in a crisis right now. I don't have to be 100% productive. Maybe I can give myself a little bit of a break. So adopting a non-judgmental stance. One of my favorite, really easy to use tricks with perfectionism is, is this the way that you would talk to your partner, best friend, child? Would you make sure that you're speaking to yourself with the same level of compassion that you would to others? And hopefully you would speak to others compassionately.
Hopefully. Speaking of speaking to others, so I have a question for you. Normally, when I talk to my friends, we'll meet up at the bar, we'll meet up for lunch, grab a coffee, and that's where I have the opportunity to talk about my feelings, maybe some of my challenges, share my celebrations. Now, I've only got my partner in immediate proximity, and she's incredible, but sometimes I want to talk to my buddy Jeremy. So how do I approach that? Do I text him and say, hey, Jeremy, can we get on Zoom and talk about our feelings, please? When we don't normally cross paths with friends, how do we reach out for support?
Yeah, I think in my mind, this is where kind of boundaries and structure comes in really, really nicely, is that having some times and some places that are dedicated towards socializing, I think is fundamentally important. So I know at the end of my day, my son and I actually we walk the dog. And this is something I've built in. He's not really my social buddy, but that's something that I've built in as a 15-minute slot. We walk the dog around the block, we come back. But I have to actually notice myself I have to actually put that same intentionality around scheduling social events. And so even if you're your buddy who you go and have a beer with, or you go and play racquetball or whatever it is you do normally with your buddies, if you're not set up to have that sort of social emotional experience, you can kind of get your feet wet by even just scheduling time and starting off throwing in a couple of I feel statements, like, oh,
Mm,
like, how are you doing? Institute that check-in mentality again. You can check in with your friends to try to open the door and to set up that space.
right. Oh, so yeah, started out fun, and then you can ease into the more serious stuff. I guess kind of like you would in real life.
Exactly.
Are there ways, back to employers, how can they be supportive of employees even if they have to provide bad news or are unable to guarantee future plans, guarantee rehire, such as that?
Yep. So this is, I sort of think of this as akin to, which no one is actually really that good at, but sort of akin to, like, how would you handle if you had all your faculties, how would you handle a great breakup to
Oh,
deliver bad news? So first of all, staying calm is just unbelievably important. So if you need to ground yourself, or in order to fake it till you make it, takes 10 deep breaths. We've got some great resources actually on our Octave website about how to do different kinds of breathing to help ground you for conversations like this. Um, be really firm and clear where you can. Oftentimes, our own stress levels obfuscate our ability to communicate clearly. So, even if you have to rehearse before going in, it probably makes sense. Be as honest, authentic, and direct as possible. Authenticity goes a long way. Create structure. If plans are uncertain, plan anyway. If you don't know when things are going to happen, come up with a routine around communication, even if the
mm,
communication itself is unknown. So, for example, I issue at Octave what we call the COVID Beat, which is a newsletter that we started off just sending out twice a week. Even
oh,
if we had no content in it, our employees would know that we were there and that we were thinking about it. We then actually were able to move to once per week, but creating routine, creating structure, even if we don't know anything new or different.
that's cool. We do
Um,
that at Justworks too. We call it the scoop, and it goes out. Our head of people sends it out every night and just shares some relevant like business updates, health, like health stuff, and then usually a cute picture of somebody's kid. I think that's a
exactly.
such a great tool.
Favorite
So
COVID.
how can we make employees more comfortable in uncertain times? We just gave one. Do you have any other suggestions?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to be honest with you, I sort of reject the idea of making people comfortable. Like, as a psychologist, one of my favorite things to say is, like, tolerate the discomfort. And it's
Mm,
not actually our job. Comfort may not be attainable. And that actually in a time of crisis is okay. Things that can be containing and not necessarily comfortable, which is really different, are, again, structure, communication, validation of emotions that might come up for people, your own emotions, their emotions. Also, making allowances when you can regarding expectations and productivity. I think probably the most important thing is to accept and to share your acceptance with your employees that we're not actually in control right now. And one of the nice things that comes from not being in control is creativity. When you let go of trying to adopt a lot of control strategies and pretend you know things, like, really great innovation, really great creativity can happen.
wow.
And I'm not trying to be super Pollyanna-ish, but it's really powerful.
Wow. Okay, I want to get back to that in just a second. I think there's some really, really important stuff there. My last question for you is about, I just love this image, about compartmentalization. So, there's the historical business attitude of I come to work in a suit and I do my business thing, and then I go home and I have my personal life and draw a boundary. I think there's a great scene in Mad Men, if anyone's seen that. I think it's in the first season, where Joan gives Peggy a talking to, and she's like, you come in here and you're at the ad agency and you leave your baggage at the door. And obviously that is becoming sort of an outdated mentality. In a coaching situation, to recommend compartmentalization. What are your I'm not sure it's a good idea, but from a business perspective, it can be effective. What are your thoughts on it as a professional and as a person?
Yeah, so I like everything else, I sort of have, I think there are pros and cons to everything, and intentionality is key. So if you are compartmentalizing as a coping strategy, which is leading towards inauthentic behavior, a presentation of a false self, like you're going to get a pretty strong reaction from others when you're not really connected to what you're doing. That being said, we compartmentalize all the time, every day. My husband and kids certainly don't get the same version of me that my teams do, or even that my patients do. And so there is a natural, adaptive, intentional compartmentalization,
Mm,
which I think actually goes to the idea of back to mindfulness, which is really the intentional focus that we place on one thing or another. So I guess
mm,
I would maybe adapt compartmentalization and the idea of maybe if we think about like how strong are the walls and the barriers between the different compartments, and how much inauthentic self versus authentic self are we letting come in. But I think we all play roles, and we all show ourselves, we'll show up differently in different environments.
absolutely. This brings me to my quick list of HR tips and tricks for maintaining mental health and business strategy. The first is, this is going to be 4 tips. The first is to acknowledge. I think the importance of acknowledging everything that's going on, the struggles people are having, and the business realities. Sarah, you talked to this earlier. The second one, contextualize the narrative. Sarah, I know we had a great conversation before about the difference between contextualizing and controlling the narrative, your life, the circumstances. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on that and why you favor that language, contextualize as opposed to control.
Yeah, I think so. Again, the reality is we don't have a lot of control right now over what's happening. And so I think this goes back to what I was saying about the inauthentic self and the authentic self. There's this idea, one of the things we talked about, Moses, was the definition of the word confidence. And in
Right.
Latin, confidence actually means con, which is with, and the fidens part means fidelity in Latin. And so the word together means with fidelity. And so our society has sort of
Yeah.
abstracted the word confidence into this false presentation of certainty and control, when really all it means is being true to oneself. And the more focused on being authentic with our own emotional experience and presenting that and sharing it with others, when appropriate in a business setting, back to our compartmentalization piece, it really allows us to be free to acknowledge the other person in the room. So
Mm,
setting a context for someone, giving them an understanding of where you're coming from, where they're coming from, what the situation is incredibly important. Having them understand what's happening in the business, and having them understand why they're getting laid off, why you have to reduce their salaries. All of those things are fundamentally important, set in context. But
got it.
that feels really different than trying to control the situation or make them think one thing or another.
That's beautiful. Speaking of, my third tip is to not make promises. I loved what you said about embracing uncertainty and or embracing discomfort rather, and how trying to attain that might be a fool's errand. I just want to say from the HR perspective how crucial it is not to make promises to employees for re-engagement or for ending a furlough, bringing them back on. In U.S. employment law, we have the at-will doctrine. It's presumed in 49 states and Washington, D.C. The outlier is Montana, fun fact. Um, and employers should not waive their right to the at-will doctrine, which says that employers do not need to establish cause or provide notice for termination. And so to make a promise not only could be psychologically damaging to your employees, but highly risky to your business as far as putting untenable promises down on paper, which at best could be bad for morale, at worst could get you in actually in serious legal trouble. My fourth tip is to maintain future-oriented messaging. This sounds a little bit of a platitude, but I think it's important. One thing I wanted to ask you about, Sarah, is managing survivor guilt of employees. The employees who do stick around, how do we engage with them, assure them to the extent that is responsible as far as their job security, and then how do we authentically consider potential upsides? What I'm not saying here to go out and say, it's going to be great, folks, just hang in there, but really to embrace the potential opportunities that there are for the business when it comes to, like, for example, maybe you'll find out that at 80% of your staff, you can run at 100% effectiveness. Wouldn't that be a great thing to discover? Maybe this will put you into a position of agility where you can pivot your business and explore new opportunities in these times of austerity, whereas otherwise you wouldn't. So Sarah, that coming back to survivor guilt, I really want to hear your thoughts on that. And then how do we imbue optimism with authenticity?
Yeah, I think, and the interesting thing about survivor guilt and guilt in general is it's usually predicated on what we call a maladaptive thought or something that isn't quite true, or black and white thinking. So
Okay.
anything fear-based kind of is a heuristic. It sort of makes us very pigeonholed into our thinking. And so if you identify or someone is coming to you, your employees are coming to you, and they have survivor's guilt, kind of taking some time to take a step back and understand what that maybe incorrect or black and white thought can be really useful. Also encouraging them to seek out help if you don't feel, I mean, you may not feel equipped to do that, or that it's your personal, your job to start psychologizing your employees.
Good point.
But if you can't, or if you can't sort of help them see the positive out of this, or implore to them the fact that they're still there is a testament to their competence. I think it's also totally reasonable to provide resources for them to seek help outside at a place like Octave. I'll just pitch Octave for a minute. Yeah.
Or an employee assistance program. All Justworks customers, benefits eligible employees benefit from an employee assistance program, which involves many things, including like helping you write your will, but most urgently and most utilized is employees calling in to speak to a licensed therapist 24/7. Everyone who picks up the phone is a licensed counselor. You can talk to them about workplace issues, personal issues, and it doesn't end up going back to your employer. So it's not a whistleblower hotline. It's like truly a safe space where you can get help and a differing perspective. Cool. So I'm super excited to move into some live Q&A. One question, a few customers wrote in, or attendees wrote in questions ahead of time. There's one that was really poignant and uncomfortable that I wanted to get to in this context. So, and then we'll go into live Q&A. My first question, though, that came in is, how do you guide your team members if one of your staff passes away during this period?
Yeah, so I think in terms of guiding your preparing, I think is one of the most important things. Preparing, asking the question, and preparing for again, empathy, really authentic connection, and again, all of those other things we talked about in terms of asking them what do they need at this time. I think by the end of this, if you haven't already, we will all know someone who either has passed away or who has a family member or a friend who does. So empathy, 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 understanding, help them set expectations, understanding that you're in a power position and they may not be able to ask for themselves. Give them the support, offer it, even if they're in a critical role. The most, if you can give people time and space to heal and recover and to feel, again, connected and protected, they will also be able to recover more quickly. Don't have expectations for folks who are suffering with loss and who are suffering with grief that are unrealistic. I think is a good place to start.
Thank you so much. It's a lot to process there. Thank you. That's it's so much more nuanced than the HR lens, which is kind of like throw an on-site therapist at them and hope for the best. So thank you for those insights. Our first live question comes from Robert Acton. Can you share more about mindfulness? That seems to be the big question, huge topic, receiving a lot more attention, and mindfulness is receiving more mindfulness as of late. If you had to, sorry to put you on the spot, Sarah, if you had like a
No.
definition of mindfulness, what would it be? And then how do we practice it? You could probably spend the rest of the day answering this question. But
yeah, I could, but I can actually make this very simple. The way I like to describe mindfulness is, first of all, is oftentimes people think about it as a light switch that they can flip on or off. It's not at all. I think of mindfulness as a muscle, and it's a muscle that, just like any other muscle in your body, you need practice to grow. So mindfulness is the practice of intentionally turning your attention to one thing or another. So you can be mindful in 1 second. So when I'm very, very anxious and my mind is racing and I have lots of thoughts flooding through my head, just taking one step, one moment to notice that, I'm really anxious right now. There, bam, I've achieved mindfulness success. Or I can extend that into a half an hour yoga practice where I'm attending to and intentionally focusing on the way that my mind is interacting with my body. So again, continuum. Mindfulness is just the actual practice of shifting your attention in an intentional manner. That's it. That's all it is. In terms of how to practice it, there are so many different ways. As I said, you can take 1 second, take a step back, and just notice something. There are a lot of great exercises. I would send you to Mindspace. I would send you to, we have a mindfulness partner actually in San Francisco called Within that's doing some great virtual stuff. But if you just Google mindfulness, there are tons of things that will come up in terms of practicing it.
Thank you. Wow. I'm gonna move on to anonymous attendee. What a strange name. Their question. But can you ask your unpaid leave employees on furlough or unpaid leave, how they're doing monetarily if they need a temporary loan? Thanks for your question. I'll start with this one. Inquiring into employees' personal financial situation in most cases is not strictly unlawful. However, it can be problematic. Employees have no no expectation of privacy in the workplace, digitally or physically. I believe that they should have an expectation of privacy in their personal lives and how they maintain their personal finances. There are some times where employers get involved, like if you have somebody who's in has a job doing financial things and they appear to be mismanaging their personal finances, that's usually the time that an employer will get involved. In this case, I wouldn't recommend it. As far as a temporary loan, an employer is not a bank. I do talk to customers a lot about loaning employees money, fronting them paychecks. It gets messy, especially if you implicate payroll because of taxation and tax withholding involved. It just, no good deed goes unpunished, and it can do more harm than good. What I would instead do is maybe take some time and invest in educating employees about resources available to them under the CARES Act. Unemployment insurance benefits have been strengthened tremendously right now. Remind employees, help maybe guide them through that process, and be sure not to contest their claim. But I don't think an employer is ultimately the one in the position to help employees financially directly. Do you have any thoughts on that, Sarah?
No, I think that sounds good. I think it also, it really depends. Are you a huge company? Are you a tiny company? What's the nature of your
Right.
your job? How invested? I know um, my private practice group, where I have a lot of 1099 contractors.
Hmm.
I think that sort of has a very different feel than at Octave, where people are employees. So I think it probably depends on the types of relationships you have as well, although I defer to you entirely in terms of the loan.
Thanks. Another more HR-oriented question from Anonymous, might be the same one, who knows? We are laying off one person today, reducing everyone else's salaries significantly as well. The person who will be laid off will be with us for 7 more days. So we gave 7 days notice. What is the best way for us to be sensitive to them over the next 7-day period? Thanks for your question. These times are unprecedented. My peacetime HR advice is to never give employees advance notice of bad news, except in exceptional circumstances. For a termination, it's typically a very inadvisable to give somebody, for example, 1 week's notice of involuntary termination for performance. They can become disgruntled. They can do some damage, maybe to your IT system, to the company morale, or they can sort of invent barriers to termination. Like, to be honest, all of a sudden they might develop a disability, and now all of a sudden there's some legal barriers to termination that weren't there before. These all this is to say, these times are a little different. It's perfectly reasonable to give somebody notice, especially when it's due to external circumstances. The way to be sensitive is, maybe Sarah, you can speak more to this, but mindfulness, receptiveness, utilize some of your emotional piggy bank to to validate their concerns and what's going on, and to speak to the reality of things authentically. I think I wouldn't want to remind an employee of this too gruffly, but anyone should be grateful to be remaining employed right now during this time. 7 days notice, that's 7 days later than it could have been. So not that I'm saying you should go around saying you ought to be grateful, but keep in mind that everyone is probably going to be a little more sensitive to small businesses right now and the difficulties they're facing, as well as individuals. Theory has a question on, is there a difference of laying off an employee and furloughing them? Okay, there aren't too many mental health implications, but I'm getting this question all the time and I'd love to get into it a little bit. Laying off an employee is a termination, and the reason is reduction in force or layoffs or business conditions. And so this is one more preamble I want to quickly say. I mentioned the at-will doctrine earlier. Employers under the at-will doctrine are not obligated to establish cause when terminating someone. So legally speaking, it looks pretty much identical when somebody's terminated for performance as opposed to economic conditions. So that is, the relationship has been severed. They no longer have health insurance with you. They're off the group health plan, and they can avail themselves of unemployment insurance benefits, usually if they're considered out of work through no fault of their own. So that's a layoff. Furlough can actually mean different things in different contexts. I've been steering my customers away from this term because they might come to the table with preconceptions as to what it is when it is not strictly defined under labor law what exactly that is. For example, you might remember the TSA workers a few months ago, or maybe it was longer than that, were, because the government couldn't agree on a budget, they were expected to keep working without pay. Now, that is only permissible in the public sector. Private employers cannot force employees to keep working without pay and then only to catch it up later. That's not possible. You have to maintain minimum wage and overtime pay requirements. So furloughing, the way most people are using it right now, is unpaid leave with continuation of health insurance. So you stop someone's cash compensation, but they remain on the group health plan and you maintain your employer contribution to premiums. Whenever you're speaking to someone about that, I would be explicit about what exactly the terms of the relationship are, what exactly furlough constitutes for your company. I'll leave it at that and move on to the next question. But my point is to be explicit and don't assume that everyone has the same definitions for these sort of more esoteric words like furlough. Grace Murray. Hey, Grace, I've talked to you before. We have furloughed employees where the hope and intention is to bring employees back. What tips or advice or cautions would you give for the non-impacted employees in terms of communication with impacted employees? We want to continue to support those who have been affected and encourage connection, but we aren't sure what parameters or guidance we should provide. Sarah, I'd love to kick that one to you first. The HR implications are mostly around morale. So naturally, employees have relationships outside of the office environment. Tips for interaction between those who stay and those who had to go.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting here, if there are no HR implications, if you've spoken to them already, one of the interesting things here is just noticing, I think what happens, there are natural friendships and relationships that occur in the workplace that of course we want to encourage in order to maintain morale and maintain community. And at the same time, those folks who are in the office and are going to be put in an awkward position, not only in terms of how their own feelings of survivor's guilt, as we sort of alluded to earlier, but also the potential to kind of get into some of those unhealthy communications around like, well, what's happening in the office? So I think that some of the tips I would be mindful of are be really aware of how those communications are feeling. If they start to feel off, if they're making you feel bad, if they're making you feel guilty, it's okay to actually set boundaries, to keep things very light, to keep things very personal, to really not talk about what's going on in the workplace. I know that can get tricky, especially if you have informal mentee, mentor relationships, but I think it probably feels safer that way. Pay attention to your own emotions as signals of what is appropriate, what feels good, or what doesn't. I think employees who still have positions really need to also be mindful that it's not their responsibility to take care of folks who are impacted. Again, that can be exhausting. They're not necessarily trained as caregivers, and that, again, provide validation, empathy, but they don't actually have to do anything. And they should know that. They should know that it's not their job to be responsible for folks who are impacted.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah, seriously. This will be our last question. It's a little bit related to what we talked about, and one that I am personally really excited to talk about. In HR, there's like t-shirts that say this, and it's the joke that it's like, I'm in HR. That means I'm a coach, a therapist, a mentor, an attorney, right? It's like I have to put on all these hats. So Generation Citizen Staff is asking about psychologizing employees. Uh, he or she is an HR professional at a small nonprofit and often feels like they're asked to do this, to psychologize employees by management and employees themselves. But he or she says, it makes me uncomfortable because I'm not trained in that. So how do HR professionals set boundaries with employees as far as expectations of what their capabilities are and aren't?
Yeah, and I think so I apologize. Psychologizing employees is not a real phrase. I sort of just made it up right now. Psychologizing is not even a real word. So I apologize for
Totally.
that. But I think, but it's really true. And it's something that as a psychologist, I have to set boundaries for myself too. People on an airplane tend to flock to me. They just know, they just feel somehow that they can start opening up to me. And so practicing that boundary setting
Wow.
is really important. And you can often use hand signals, which are actually very subtle nonverbals, to say,
Mm.
wow, and use that validation. Like, wow, I hear that you're going through a lot right now. Let me make a recommendation for someone who's more appropriate to talk to. I would love to be able to help. And unfortunately, I'm just not trained in this. When people are emotionally dysregulated, they are, or they sound out of control, which oftentimes HR professionals, bless you all, have to deal with all the time is people who are dysregulated. And I think really owning how that's feeling for you. Wow, I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling how much you're feeling. Using feeling statements as a way to connect and bring people back into the relationship with you can often pull them outside themselves, and then you can reallocate or redirect them to appropriate resources like an EAP or Octave therapist.
Wow. Thank you for such an intellectual and thoughtful response. Seriously. One recommendation I have for HR professionals out there is in a prior role, I would have employees speak to me about problems with their manager and pull me into a room and sit me down and just go. And I actually found it really helpful to cut employees off and say, just so you know, please share whatever you'd like, but this is not a safe space. I work for the company, and ultimately my interest and my role is to protect the organization. So I just want to give you the courtesy of knowing that before you really open up to me about everything you're feeling, and using me as an agent for change, whatever that might be. So setting those boundaries and those expectations are super important. People have in their minds lots of ideas of what HR is, and it's important to, I think, be forthright about what they actually truly are at your organization. Well, that wraps things up. We went a little long to make sure we had plenty of time for Q&A. That's kind of the fun part. Again, this is the first in a series of Ask the Expert, so please be sure to join us next time. For all registrants, those who attended and did not, you can look out for a video recap of the webinar, as well as information on forthcoming webinars and additional resources in an email that you can expect in your inbox shortly. So thanks again so much for joining us, Sarah. Seriously, such a joy and a privilege to speak with you and benefit from your expertise.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thanks for coming, everyone. With that, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Stay inside, stay safe, and be well.